Hi, welcome
Hello.
to Kitchen Chats. I'm your host, Aimee Kandrac, and I am here today with Chad Priest, who is the Vice President of the American Red Cross for the Southwest and Western regions. You are covering 12 states now,
Yeah.
and you have a background as a lawyer, as a nurse, as you did not list this, but as a lifeguard at the local swimming pool.
Probably most importantly.
You're teaching emergency medicine. You are really the epitome of the first responder. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with you about what friends and loved ones can do when there's a natural disaster. So thanks for joining me in my kitchen.
Thanks, Aimee. It's great to be here. You're listening. It's a beautiful, freezing day, but the light is great, and I'm just pleased to be with you. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks. So I like to start every conversation as a reminder to our listeners and to you. Kitchen Chats is all about those times when something happens in your life and you call your friends and loved ones and you figure out those next steps. And I'm wondering if you have one of those moments that you would be willing to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I live a pretty charmed life. You know, I've got a great family. Both of my parents are still alive. Both of my wife's parents are still alive. And to be honest, we have avoided singular traumatic. Now, listen, we're a family. We've had our share of traumatic moments, right? But as I think about the time when we really had to pull it together around the kitchen, I go back to the 2 weeks before all the lockdowns started to happen around COVID. Mm-hmm. And for me, this was both a personal issue, like for all people on the globe, but it was also professional. And so in the 15 to 16 days where the demand signals around the globe really started to indicate something was way off the rails, we had to sit down and have a pre-conversation with the family, which is, I just distinctly remember it sitting around the counter with my wife saying, here's the approach we're going to take. How will we keep a cadence in our household when the whole world shuts down? Something we said out loud, but of course couldn't appreciate even as we were saying it. But to have that conversation 2, maybe even 3 weeks before anyone was talking that way made me feel part prepper, which was not, which was kind of scary, but also like, really deciding how we would go through that crisis, because, you get to make a decision about how you go through these things. And so that was the most memorable. And in the moment, the gravity of that, I think, at the time, there's a saying in emergency stuff. We often say you don't know you're in an emergency until later, right? You often can't appreciate it. I felt like that time had slowed down. We sort of knew as we were talking. So at any rate, that's the most memorable, I think, of recent memory.
I think that is one that so many people had to have.
Of course.
And is going to be a memory for our kids, especially. And I know for us, and I won't dwell on it too much, but that was something that we didn't know we were in that emergency situation until it was upon us, in the same way that you maybe had a little more knowledge. But then we had to stand in our kitchen a lot of different times and reevaluate our plan.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Sure.
And so that is a kitchen moment that I think everyone can appreciate.
Yeah, I figured as much.
Oh.
I don't think that's unique to me.
Well, but I think every one of those conversations is unique, right? Every family has different ways that they were going to handle their unique situations.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of my work in emergency and crisis management is really understanding the differences that make a difference between people who get through a crisis well and maybe those communities or people who sort of suffer. And one of the many, many markers of that is, but people who tend to adopt regularity, people who can enforce discipline through change, do much better, right? And there's just tons of data around this. And so I remember trying to apply that evidence-based standard to my family.
Oh, Dad, how did that go?
Yeah, it went about as well as you could expect. But I appreciate that we tried, so like we're still going to get up at a certain time. This is like early on, right? We can do this for a month, right?
Oh, gosh, right. Remember when we thought we were doing that?
Yeah. So at any rate, it was a repeating kitchen moment.
It was a repeating kitchen moment. But you've brought up something that's really good, and maybe we should just start with the preparedness, right? And the people who are prepared for the crises that they don't think are going to happen can actually do a little bit better. And I don't want to have everyone freak out, but I think they're actually, as I was thinking about things we wanted to talk about today, one of the things that we tried to do during COVID when we were had a lot of extra time was do a house inventory. And it seemed ridiculously prepper, you know? But I think there are probably things that people should be thinking about, like as severe weather might approach. Are there any things that people should be doing or...
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that there's probably a minimal level of preparedness everybody should have in their house. You know, I mean, I'll go talk to people and say, hey, do you have enough stuff in your basement if there was a power outage? Could you get through a day or two? And you know, answers to that vary, by the way. You know, I work at the Red Cross, and we publish a lot of materials on what are the things you should have in your house, you know, how much water, you have first aid kits and things like that. And I don't want to take away the importance of those things, but I do bear a different sort of angle of news on this, which is sort of at the end of the day, the single best evidence-based predictor of your ability to get through a crisis is whether you know your next door neighbors. And this is often overlooked. You just can't, I think COVID showed all of us this truth. You cannot stalk your way out of a crisis. We couldn't even get gloves and masks for healthcare workers. You know, there's a point at which the logistics chain just doesn't work. Now, maybe you're the kind of prepper that has like a seed garden and you know, you have a missile silo in your backyard you can go to. Let's accept those.
Those are a little different.
That's on the outlier, right?
Right.
But I think the number one thing people can do is recognize that we live in a society and that our social network ultimately predicts our survival in pretty much every way. And you can take that at the simplest level. People who know their neighbors tend to do things for them, right? It's human nature, and we're genetically wired to do that. That's part of sort of evolution for humans. But we really only juice up into that when we know someone. And I always use the example of you know, shoveling someone's sidewalk, right? You're just more likely to do the extra work if you know, Miss whomever is maybe not so mobile or can't get out and do it. You don't know that if you don't know the neighbor. And increasingly in this country and around the world, we don't know our neighbors. Yeah. And we can get on the YouTube, that really sounded like a boomer comment. And we can get on Zoom or something and talk to people all around the world, but we may not be able to contact our next door neighbor, which is a problem for preparedness for really anything.
For really anything. And that is one that I have been really fortunate. We've always had good neighbors. But just having their phone number.
Yeah, that's right.
For any kind of situation. One time we had a small natural disaster happen at our house where we had a massive tree fall. And it was the neighbors who were able to call us when we were out of the state and say, something is really, really not okay. Like, your house will not have power. You're not going to be able to get back in. The garage is destroyed. All of these things, because your neighbors are right there.
That's right. And I don't want to sound pedantic about this because this is what I do for a living, and even I don't know all my neighbors. So I'm acutely aware of how difficult this is in the way we've organized society. I'll tell you who does know, if you're fortunate still to have young children in your house, they tend to be sort of little vectors of connection, right? They're out in the neighborhood. They tend to know everything. I'll never forget, my oldest daughter came back and said, this is the name of the neighbors. And I'm like, how do you know that? It's just like, I was hanging out with them, or I talked to them. So to your point, those connections need to be intentionally fostered. And something as simple as having a list of, here are the 5 people around us and their names and phone numbers, is an enormously resilient strategy. Enormous. So much so that if you did that and didn't do anything else, I could pretty much predict you'd probably be fine during most issues.
Well, and asking everyone else in your household who lives around us. Right.
They may know.
Because they may know. Yeah. And, with without sounding too like Ethel Kravitz, crazy next door neighbor lady, which I'm sure
That's a great reference. Yeah,
I'm sure I've been called that at different points. But sharing that then with the rest of your neighbors can be really helpful as well, to say, hey, I have gone ahead and compiled this list of, the 6 of us right here on the corner. Now we can all get a hold of each other if anything does happen. And some of these natural disasters, it's not happening to just one of you.
Oh, of course, sure. I mean, we're sitting in the Midwest of the United States, but the risk profile is different everywhere. I mean, power goes out here reliably, 2 or 3 times a year during the spring for storms. We have ice, so there are risks everywhere that affect communities. And I should note that we have innovated ways to create connections that don't seem to be as durable in crisis. So, for example, we're very well connected in other ways. I'm thinking of Nextdoor app as a great example. There may be a useful use case for Nextdoor app in many settings. Traditionally, it is not a good substitute for knowing your neighbor.
Right. Well,
it's just different. It's just different.
Well, because when a natural disaster happens to your house, it's so personal.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
So it doesn't matter if it's a hurricane that takes out the entire community, it's still personal to you. And if it's a house fire, it might be just your home. But, wildfires or tornadoes, again, they're usually more than just you personally, but it is such a personal experience. And so it's great because the Red Cross comes in and helps in all of these situations, but there's a lot of stuff that they're not doing, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff insurance companies are not doing.
Sure, that's right. There's definitely unmet need, and you can buy your way. You can buy your way to a certain amount of resilience, right? So if you're in a hurricane-prone community and you get warning and you're of means, you can just whip out the credit card, fill up the gas tank, and go, right? So there are some cheats around this, but those are few and far between, because ultimately, and especially with the climate crisis we're facing, our risk profile is just dramatically altered. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, going back to your original question, should you have some stuff? Are there things you can do to be prepared? Of course. In my basement, we have some water. We have flashlights. We have helmets because we live in a tornado-prone area, and so if you're going to be in the basement, it's nice to be able to cover your noggin in case there's debris. Now, I'll tell you what else we have down there, which is a lot of wine, and so I don't want to make it sound like we've got it all together. But knowing our neighbors, that ultimately is, at the end of the day, the best defense you have.
I think that is great. So let's move into something does happen. And what are some of the first things that friends and loved ones can do to help? Because there's a lot of stuff that friends and loved ones can't do to help. Like, we can't necessarily rebuild your house for you, but we can help you rebuild some memories. And we can come help with even more practical things as well.
Yeah, one of my longstanding volunteer partners, Allison Barber, tells a great story when she was in Northern California after a wildfire just destroyed a community, and she was kind of going through the neighborhood, offering assistance, and Red Cross workers do this pretty routinely. Mm-hmm. And she saw a guy just sifting through. There was just nothing left of his home, maybe a couple of pieces of wood, but the rest was just completely ash. And he was sifting through and sort of taking pennies and nickels that he would find and sort of collecting them. And she, as she tells the story, she said, what are you doing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what are you doing? And his response was, well, every one of these things I find, every nickel, every dime, every quarter is a step closer to turning me into a victor instead of a victim, right? This idea that I'm gaining control over the situation that's in front of me. And I think whether you've experienced a major natural disaster, whether you've just lived through one of the largest global pandemics we'll experience in our lives, right? There's no shortage of what ifs, a hurricane, that at the end of the day, people are searching for themselves in these moments. And so I often think first is being present to people's real situation. I mean, it can be very difficult. It's funny, I often take this for granted. I see people almost always when they're at their worst.
Right.
It's a gift, really, that I have to be with them in those moments, but I completely take it. I suppose this is what it's like being a physician in a hospital, and that you take for granted the invitation you've been given to be with people in that space.
And it's really raw and vulnerable.
Yeah, and it's funny because, it's what I do for a living and it's my passion. And so I often forget how difficult it can be for other people to go into those spaces, right? To be with someone who's hurting. And it is, for a lot of people, it's just awkward, right?
Yeah.
What do you say to someone who's lost their house?
Right.
Well, it's okay to say, I'm sorry you lost your house. But that may feel vacuous, or that may feel, do they need to hear from me? And so one of the things I always like to tell folks is just be present. Just be present in a way that's authentic and comfortable. And if your love language is phone calls, great. If it's a text, great. What I think, and again, I'm sort of extrapolating and a little bit projecting what I like, so I have to be a little careful.
Right.
But just acknowledging, hey, I heard you went through this thing. I want you to know I'm thinking about it. If you need anything, let me know. Or if you're not prepared to do anything, which is okay too, by the way.
Which is okay too.
Yeah, sometimes we all think we have to roll up our sleeves and jump in. To just say, I understand this is happening. I'm thinking about you. I not to be Pollyannish, this is really your area of expertise, but that strikes me as highly impactful.
I think it's highly impactful, and remembering that it's okay if you don't necessarily have the right words to say, but just to say, I am thinking about you, you are on my mind, and to continue to do it, right? Because none of these experiences are usually short-lived, right? There are long-term ramifications for almost all of these things. I struggle to think, and this is your area of expertise, so there might be really short-term things, but usually, like, insurance can take months or years to get finalized. Rebuilding anything, as small as it might be, is rarely quick, and it is emotionally draining. So checking in with your friend and loved one on a regular basis to say, and not to be surprised, oh, God, that's 6 months ago. Like, you're still dealing with this?
Yeah, that's such a good point. We often say and do things that are sort of narratives that are built in the culture that often have unintended effect. And I love what you said about sort of keeping, coming back and being persistent in your expressions of care, right? The truth is that after a disaster in particular, there's a trauma response, right? So you literally are dealing with a trauma response. And there are, we tend to celebrate, which is not good in our culture, really resilient people who look really resilient and have it all together, right?
Right, and they're rarely.
That's not, I mean, yes, I'm sure there are people like that. I often say they're just delaying, they're just delaying the inevitable. There's no human being that I think, or maybe there are, but very few, who are really that capable. And the truth is that after a major event, whether it's and sadly we deal with a ton now of violence, sort of man-made disaster shootings and things of the nature,
Right.
that our reactions are completely normal reactions to very abnormal events. And this is how we tend to frame it with the clients we work with, which is your fear, your stress, your inability to sleep, your lack of appetite, your anxiety. Those are all completely normal. The events that you find yourself are abnormal. And we need to start situating your reaction, your trauma response, as completely normal. I think friends can do that for each other.
Right.
Right?
Well, and reminding friends that this is a traumatic event. They are going through a trauma response the same way that someone might be experiencing any kind of major health event. Grief is real when you are going through some of these things. And knowing that there's a long process to get through it.
Oh, totally. I think the other thing that's really someone the other day. This is a bad example, but it proves the point. I had a friend of mine had a meeting coming up, and the friend remembered. Oh, he's got this meeting coming up, and that morning he sent me a note. Hey, I think your meeting's today. Right? That's kind of like PhD level friendship, right? Sort of advanced caring. But the point is, it demonstrated continuing desire to be present for me. And I think if we can do that for folks who have gone through something untoward, hey, I realize it's been a couple of months since your home fire, and I'm guessing you're just still sifting through, maybe not physically, but mentally, through all of what that means. I think that normalizes, like you said, and is very powerful.
Well, and they might actually still be sifting through papers.
For certain.
That is one thing. I think there are all of the emotional supports that we cannot forget, but I think there are some things that you can do in your physical presence right after some of these disasters. Not all of the time. I don't mean like, oh, disaster happens, everyone go and swarm. That is what the Red Cross is for. They should go in there first. But like I go to experiences in my life. Again, we're in Indiana. We've had a lot of trees come down because of the neighborhood that we live in. Like all of the homes that I've lived in have had like trees come down or tornadoes hit or neighbors have had these kinds of things. Basements flood. People have come over with chainsaws.
Sure.
People have come over, and I've done this for friends and my sister. When her basement's flooded, I've grabbed a bunch of gloves and some rubber boots, and we've had to, like, you know, haul water out of the basement. So there are some tactical things that people can do when and because when something happens on a large scale, I feel like there's flooding that happens a lot in the Midwest especially, and it's happening to a lot of people at once. So getting a crew to come in isn't always in everyone's budget, and logistically, like, there just might not be enough. So you might have to do it yourself.
Yeah, you said something earlier that then prompted me to say, well, it's in our DNA to care for sort of one another, and it's also in communities' DNA. So I look at I work and study and practice resilience building at a community level, and the community is not just a collection of the people in it; it's really its own unit of measure and of work. And the good news is that communities are really hardwired to do the right thing after crisis. So we can see disaster after disaster after disaster. Anthropologists have studied this forever. There's a wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit called, the name's going to come back to me in a second, and it's about communities that arise out of crisis, right? And one thing we know is that when you have strong communities and bad things happen, these brigades of people with chainsaws, the meal chains, these things naturally occur. And in fact, at the Red Cross, one of the things, you say the Red Cross comes in, which is true, but our view of this is that the Red Cross is simply an idea, and we empower communities to become the Red Cross so that you have our training, you have our tools, you have our resources to go help your next door neighbor. That's when we're at our best. And we have to be careful that when NGOs come into spaces, we can inadvertently and sometimes without an option, disrupt the natural helping behaviors of communities. I'll give you a great example. The local church who is feeding people out of the basement of the church with people bringing hot dishes and doing all that. Amazing. It almost always happens immediately after a crisis. When the Red Cross, when we set up a shelter, when the Salvation Army sets up a feeding unit, when other NGOs, and there are many, the Southern Baptists, there's all sorts of people that work in this space, we're not going to be able to accept your hot dish. Right, we have very tight, food safety restrictions, and that's not bad. That's good, but it has an effect, right? And so this is the thing we have to be cognizant about, which is we need to foster neighbors caring for each other, normalize that behavior, because I'm not surprised to hear that your experience was that people came over with the chainsaw. We tend to do our best when we're at our worst for some period of time. I think COVID showed us there's an expiration date on that, but at least in the immediate after effects of a storm.
Well, and the point around COVID, and when it's an entire community affected, there's only so much energy. Of
course.
And when you're going through it at the same time, I think it's more difficult to help. Not to the same extent, right? But if I'm cleaning out my basement, at the same time I need to help you clean out your basement, my energy level is a little bit lower than if I don't have anything going on right now. I can come over and provide a lot more for you. And I think there are a lot of people for whom they can provide extra because they don't have to do it at the same time.
Yeah, and obviously when you look at community scale destruction, the ability for neighbors to work together, and that is when a national organization like the Red Cross becomes essential. And we're not the only ones, of course. One of my favorite disaster interventions that we do after huge hurricanes, huge disasters, is we'll send hundreds of We call them emergency response vehicles. That sounds fancier. They're really just vans. And they have feeding windows. We'll send those into neighborhoods with really nutritious meals, usually two, sometimes 3 a day. And we'll just circulate. And it's funny because this is a now it is high complexity at scale,
Of course.
just to be clear.
Right.
But the actual intervention itself is fairly low complexity. But imagine you're mucking out your house. We've given you all the stuff to do that, the bleach and the mops and all of that. But do you really? Someone just shows up and says, "Here's lunch if you want it." That act of caring is fuel. It is fuel. You get something like that, and you're like, "Okay, my life has not changed. My problems are not over. But can I go an extra 45 minutes?"
Yes.
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 Yeah. We do that at scale, and that's what's great about our movement, and that's what's great about neighbors who help each other. And you don't have to do that through the Red Cross. There's lots of people who do that every day.
There's lots of people who do that. And I'm so glad that you have the regulations around what you're doing. I really am. But I think that your point that it hadn't occurred to me where, like the church can just open up and do all of these things. There's a lot of things that can be provided for someone when you know your neighbors, when you know your friends.
That's right.
Because you don't have to go through
Yeah.
the tape of the Red Cross. And so I can send you a whole bunch of socks and underwear because you probably don't have that anymore. And that might be something that you really need. And I can guess your size better than whatever another organization has. And I think there are things that your community, your really close community, that can do for you that no one else can do. And one of those is helping you rebuild memories. Because sometimes all of your memories might be gone, right? So we live in a digital age, and for my children, they might like to think that their entire life is stored on the cloud somewhere.
But it's not.
But it's really not. Even like first birthday pictures are all pictures, like actual photos. And our generation, we don't have any pictures from our childhood that aren't actual pictures, right?
It was nice.
It was a little different, and but if something were to happen and either of our houses were demolished, you would need to rely on your family and your friends to help rebuild those memories. And having them send and collect your old high school yearbooks, right? Like those can be gone, and that's not something that and I'm not diminishing what the Red Cross does.
No, I understand. That's right.
Here are all of the memories and things where I think friends and loved ones can really step in, because you can buy new dishes, you can buy new socks and underwear, but really it's all of those photos. It's all those family heirlooms.
Yeah, I can tell you that we tend to think about our work in terms of basic needs, right? So we are really laser focused on guiding people through recovery, but we're still talking about basic needs, right? What are the financial resources you're going to need to get through the next week, the next 2 weeks, the bridge assistance you might need to get till your insurance comes in, and while we do have trained mental health workers who I think would ask questions about this, they would be completely ill-equipped to help you rebuild those memories, because that's not their function, right? It's the function of your friends and family. So I really like your point, and now you're making me really think about how ill-prepared I am in terms of memory preservation.
Right? Memory preservation.
Yeah, so I'll have to go do some work, like select a number of pictures to put in a safe deposit box or something. I don't know. I don't know how you digitize everything. Yeah, it's a great issue.
It's a great issue. I'm really fortunate. My mom's retired recently, and this is one of her passions, is like digitizing things. But not everyone has that. And then there's still things that if something were to happen, right? Like I wouldn't be able to get back that box of old T-shirts that I probably don't need to keep, but I have them because they're special memories. But any of those old things. And I tend to have been the person in the family who has had the opportunity maybe to collect some of the old family heirlooms. But if those are gone, they're gone. But there are other people in my family who have other pieces, and I was thinking, if something were to happen to one of my cousins or my sister, what things could I then share from my collection so that they could still continue to have memories?
Yeah, that's a great thought for sure. That's a great thought.
And then what else can I do to provide comfort as someone's going through this? Because the basics are, obviously they're essential, right? That's what you do. You guys have that as a core thing. But there are comforts that you can bring a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Red Cross isn't going to do that.
No, and I don't
Sometimes
think
that helps. Not long term. Yeah, it's like one of those asterisks. For anyone listening, not long term. That's not a long term solution.
The Vice President
That's
of the Red Cross
yes.
does not endorse.
But yeah, and as we're talking, one of the things that I think is also worth saying is that sometimes you have a need, a desire to help, and there may not be a readily available outlet for you to do that, right?
A lot of times there's not.
Yeah, someone doesn't want your help, they're not ready to receive it. You want to help, but you don't have the skills to help that person, and so...
And or at the position where they are currently.
Yeah, right. Like maybe you're the person that, this is great. My wife is a perfect example of this. My wife, anyone can talk to my wife about anything, and she has this really wonderful gift. So if somebody was in a massive challenge at the moment, you really want someone like her, right?
She is lovely.
I am not the right person for that. And I do, but to your point, maybe a week later I'm your guy, or And I say this, and this isn't a shameless plug, but there is an outlet, and that is that people after disasters that happen far away experience this all the time. So you see something on the news like 9/11, or you see the hurricanes that just really battered Southwest Florida, and you want to do something. This is a very normal thing to do, and you may not know someone that's directly affected. What I would say is listen to that, because that drive is really existential for our species. So we really want you to tap into that and say yes to that.
And it's going to help create a better community, a stronger community in the other anyway.
Where you live, right? And that's the thing I really sort of tell folks, which is, don't ignore it. Don't say there's nothing I can do. You can always come volunteer with the Red Cross or whatever organization you're passionate about, right? And do some good. There are some things we tell people not to do. Don't send me your winter coat. Don't drop off bags of food at the local Red Cross. Now there may be organizations in your community that need that, and so it's really important to calibrate. I kind of veered off there, but
no. I think that's excellent. I think those are really good points, because I was actually speaking with a woman just in the past week who accepts clothing donations, and sending some down to Southwest Florida even. They don't need our winter coats that we have outgrown here in the Midwest. And it is really, really, really not helpful if you send them clothes that are dirty. Right?
Yes.
Which you're like, oh, I'm just cleaning out all the clothes. I'm going to put a bag together. Well, make sure they're clean, because they also don't have a washer and dryer. So maybe you need to donate laundry detergent or just packs of new clothes. Like they might need a lot of socks or a lot of underwear because they don't have access to those washers and dryers anymore.
Yeah, I mean, when we have events where folks want to help, our position at the Red Cross is we always prefer to start by having people give what they can that's right in front of them, and that's your time, right, as a volunteer, which is probably the most precious gift you can give. And not only do we accept that in crisis, we'll accept that every day. Of course, if you have the means, your treasure, right? So financial donations allow us, and I'll get back to this in a second, to do things at scale a little differently than if we get donations of goods. But that isn't to say that we don't accept donations of goods. And from time to time, in our shelters, we will open up stores where people will bring things, and we'll allow folks that are in our shelters who may need another shirt or something like that to take it. The challenge I think people don't appreciate often is that when all of that stuff you're in Sandusky, Ohio, and you've collected 5 semi-trailers of donated goods to send down to disaster victims in Alabama or Mississippi. When all of that gets there, it now becomes a job for someone, and that someone is
Or
usually the Red Cross, right?
Lots of someone's.
Yeah,
If you've got 5 semi-trucks of stuff, that's a lot.
That's nothing.
I know.
Yeah, we could get that in a matter of hours, and that creates challenges that you may not appreciate. The size of the things you're giving us can't be palletized, so we can't put them in a warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Bottles of water that are shaped differently cannot be stacked. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes this we don't waste any of this stuff, but it requires us to go to other partners, and now they are getting involved. And whether this stuff reaches the people who needs it depends. You get into issues of parity. Why did you get a Gucci shirt and the neighbor just got a T-shirt? Well, that's because we had one Gucci shirt and a T-shirt. And so organizations, not just the Red Cross, that ask for financial donations in disaster do so that they can offer things at parity that we know to be useful and needing. So we have a standard flip-flop we may buy, right? We have a standard blanket. All of that provides consistency for clients, and it also alleviates the sort of secondary disaster of managing unsolicited goods. Having said all of that, the desire to give those things, that is so good, and we're not, no one's going to turn that stuff away. But I don't think we often think about the second order effects.
I appreciate hearing and the reminders of the parity, like the disparity that comes when some things are donated. So also remembering when you are recreating memories for one friend, there might be the opportunity to recreate memories. And I say memories as a really collective term.
Yeah.
Right? Because maybe it is T-shirts. Maybe there are clothes that you remember your friend used to wear, and you're able to get those and donate them directly to your friend.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Or gift them to them rather than donate them. And then you're not creating extra burdens and layers, because it can be awkward also as the people who are receiving.
Sure.
And you don't want to you don't want to add another emotional burden.
Yeah. I know that when we had kids, I was so fortunate to have a friend group that would bring us food, and it was so helpful. And what made it really special was that they were all my running friends, and they knew exactly the way we ate. Right? So we were never in a position where we had to throw things out or fake, thank you and waste. But I can imagine that that's probably something that can happen.
Right.
If you don't know.
If you don't know.
Well,
and that's why the point that we made earlier, stay in touch. Ask your friend what they really need right now. They might not really know, but they can maybe give you an idea. And if they say, right now, I just need someone to come and sit with me, respect that. And if they say, please don't bring me any food because we don't have any power and I can't reheat it or keep it in my microwave or keep it in my fridge, then don't bring them food right now. Unless they say, hey, can you just bring us carry out from XYZ restaurant?
Yeah.
Trying to listen. And I'm talking on the very individual level, right? You do things at scale. But back to that first point that we had, if you know your neighbors, then you're going to be able to help them. And the people who know their neighbors are going to have better results.
Yeah, and the more neighbors are organized, and the more communities are organized at the block level, at the neighborhood association level, and the more they're willing to come into movements like the Red Cross movement or whatever, then those movements aren't outside people, right? It really is neighbors helping neighbors, which is
it
what
really
we
is.
want. And that's, of course, was Claire Barton's vision when she started this whole thing, and it's pretty amazing. But yeah, the idea that it's always funny when I'll always ask, well, what can I do?
Right.
Is there anything I can do for you? Right? It's a very natural question. And, I can always predict what the answer is going to be, which is no, or I'm good. If I think of anything, though, I'll let you know.
And they never
which really puts a burden on them in some ways
does.
to now think about, well, what am I going to ask Chad to do for me so that he feels helpful, right?
I mean, this is maybe why we started What Friends Do, but maybe not,
Yeah, but it does. It's a stress position that you inadvertently put someone in.
It is. And so if you can say, here are some things that I could do for you, are any of these three something that I can help with?
Yeah.
I know you have a pet. Is there, I know how to take care of cats.
Yeah.
Can I help you with that?
Yeah. Or I like going on walks, and I go on a walk by your house every Monday.
Can I
walk the dog?
Or would you like to join me to get away?
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are kind of universal. We've talked about these on the podcast. Countless kinds of situations, but remembering that in these, disaster situations that are not necessarily health related, you can still do the same thing. Like helping your friend is universal.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say, is that there's pre-help to be done, right? So I can't predict whether you'll experience a tornado or whether you're going to experience a flood, but I can predict that the incremental and exponential rise of disasters and their impact. I am predicting that. You can just put it here. It is going to continue to happen. It's going to get worse every year. And people will be exposed to crises who heretofore had never considered themselves vulnerable in that way. And so friends who are able to be a bit future predicting can, and where they have the relationship where it's appropriate, talk about the range of things that one needs to do to just be ready for the unexpected, whether that's, wills and trusts and thinking about your documents, right? Something that I know that very few people have done, right, in our country. But again, those relationships have to come first, I think.
Yeah. Well, and keeping a digital copy somewhere.
Yeah.
Or a paper copy with someone else who is maybe not in your immediate community, so that the likelihood of both of you losing those things at the same time is a little bit less.
Yeah, for sure.
Chad, are there any other big tips that you want to make sure everyone thinks about as we're talking about this really traumatic experience?
No, I think going back to the core, which is whether it's what's the difference between someone's house burning down and a whole neighborhood being destroyed? Well, nothing to the person whose house was just burnt down.
Exactly.
So the experience of disaster is hyper personal, and I just think that folks we have to get comfortable, maybe get comfortable being uncomfortable, and being willing to say, maybe even being a little vulnerable, I'm not really sure the right thing to say. But I'd really like you to know I was thinking about you. Or, to your point, here are 5 things that I'm able to do. If you ever need any of them, I hope you would call me. And if you can't figure it out, if you need tips, if you need help, you can certainly go to redcross.org. And we've got enough preparedness tips for you for any kind of disaster. We have apps you can download. You can program Siri to help you in real time. If someone needs first aid or CPR and you forget how to do it, you can just ask Siri or ask Alexa. They'll tell you. So there's help around. In fact, one of my favorite tricks, you can also donate to us that way. And usually when I'm on the speakerphone with someone, I'll say, hey, Siri, and then I won't do that here on this podcast. That would be, I think, slightly unethical.
I unplugged mine specifically for the podcast recordings, but then all of a sudden I was like, oh, did I do that today?
That's very smart of you. But no, I think presence and neighborliness and to lean into neighborliness would benefit all of us, and it has an exponential effect on the community.
I love that. So as we close, I ask all of my guests 2 final questions that I hope you're willing to answer and share. And the first is, any kind of crisis that might happen to a friend or loved one, what is your go-to? What is your favorite thing that you like to do when something happens for them?
I write a letter. I'm a letter writer. I probably write 20 to 30 letters a week still.
Like handwritten or typed?
Always handwritten. And it's difficult for disasters because oftentimes a physical address may not be available. So it maybe requires you to know a hotel they're staying at or a friend's place. But there is something about a letter which is both personal and distant. There's less pressure to feel like you have to respond. It is tactile. You can touch it. It displays a measure of thought that sounds like a big deal these days because no one writes letters, but is not a big deal. Literally, You just write a letter. And so that's kind of my go-to. And also, I'm bad. It's funny. I'm bad at texting. Someone might text me, and I might look at it and forget to respond, and then realize 2 days later I've not responded to it, which I realize in our society now is tantamount to really ignoring somebody. Although
I'll let your daughters discuss
I was going to say
that
they
with
do
you. I
that to
don't
me
need
all
to
the
though.
time. It's funny how that works, isn't it?
It is.
So yeah, I'm a letter writer.
Oh, that is really special and meaningful, and I think as a recipient of a letter, that's really special also, and it lets the recipient know, like, you took the time to do this.
Yeah,
So
it's a small
really-
investment, but it's demonstrable.
Yeah, and then the last thing, and you've mentioned one thing that people have done for you, but what is the best thing that anyone has done for you in your life when you've had any kind of even minor thing?
Well, my best friend in the world is my wife, and she's just got a great helping sense.
She does.
Yeah, she's just got a great helping sense. She'll know when to, lean in, sort of lean sideways, when she'll call it schnauzering me, when she'll have to stay on my heels a bit. And she's always right. I often don't know in the process, right? She's sometimes ahead of me. But I think that goes to consistency and persistency of care. And it is what I said earlier. I think the times in my life when I felt the most seen, the most supported, are when someone has done something as simple as saying, oh, I know there's an anniversary of X coming up. I'm going to proactively just say, that usually takes me by surprise. I'll have people do that on disasters. I realize this is the 3rd-year anniversary of that storm you went to. I know that was traumatic for you as a responder, and I just wanted you to know I was thinking of you. That is really advanced level care, and you don't have to read in the intent. Maybe they put it on their calendar. Send Chad a note that this is the 2-year. That's okay.
That's my biggest tip.
Oh, is it?
It
Well, I
is.
didn't mean to steal it.
No. It's already been shared. Don't
Oh,
worry.
good. Okay.
So that's my favorite thing, is putting it on the calendar so that
You don't have to be organically awesome every minute.
right.
Yeah.
Lean into the technology, folks.
Yeah.
Well, Chad, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much I know you have a really important high pressure job, and I appreciate the time that you are willing to take to join me in my kitchen and to share this conversation with our listeners.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I appreciate the work you're doing, which is super important. And it's been great to be in your kitchen, and I feel real humbled to have had the opportunity to be here. So thanks.
Thanks.